Webhooks in N8N are incredibly powerful. They allow us to send messages between N8N and other apps, even if those apps aren't natively supported by N8N. But webhooks can be a little confusing, so let's first touch on what they are and how to use them in N8N. So webhooks are simply a way of sending messages between apps. Because webhooks use an agreed upon structure and format, we can connect different apps together and send information between them even if they don't have an integration. So say you've got an e-commerce website, when someone hits an add to cart button, you could send a message or a webhook to the payment provider like Stripe saying this customer wants to buy this product. Stripe could then send a message back saying this person's completed payment. So let's have a look at how this works in practice. So in N8N, there's broadly three things we can do using webhooks. We can trigger workflows. So for example here, when a webhook is caught, we could go to YouTube and get a bunch of videos. This is something that I use quite a bit. We can read data. So webhooks send data. It can be through query parameters. It can be in the body. It could also be in headers. We can take that data and then use that to enter information elsewhere. So you could take some data from a webhook and pop it into an Airtable or a Google Sheet, for example. We can also respond to webhooks. So we could catch a webhook, do something inside N8N. So I'm going to show a demo later where we're going to connect this up to Lovable. We could run an AI agent, send a prompt to OpenAI, and then take that response and send it back to the webhook. So between these three, there's a huge amount of stuff you can do with webhooks inside N8N. Now let's talk about the webhook node. So if you hit tab and type in webhook, you'll see we've got two nodes available. We've got webhook and respond to webhook. Now webhook has this little orange lightning bolt next to it. That means it's a trigger. So we can use that to trigger workflows. If you click that, you'll see that we have a drop down with a few different options for the HTTP method. Now I'm just going to focus on two today because 99% of the time when working with webhooks, you're either going to be using get or post. Now post is what we use if we're submitting data. So say you've got a form and you want to submit that form data via a webhook, you're going to use the post method. If you're trying to retrieve data, so say you're using a webhook to go to a database, get some information in a row and then bring that back, we're going to use the get method. The third option, which I'm not going to explain too much detail here because this one's much better to understand when working with an example, is the respond to webhook node. Now this is its own separate node. These ones are all just basically the webhook node and you change the method. And by the way, if you're not sure what method you're using or you're going to have different HTTP requests, you can go into settings and just select allow multiple HTTP methods. But generally it's preferable to isolate this to the method that you expect. Now the respond to webhook node is kind of what it says on the tin. It's going to take the webhook from a webhook trigger. You're then going to do something with that information and then it's going to send a response back to that webhook. So this is why it's easier to understand with an example, but just so you know that it's there and kind of what it does. So next, let's have a look at setting one of these up and sending some data to a webhook. So I'm just going to go down here. Let's add a webhook node. And you'll see that we've got two URL options here. We've got a test URL and a production URL. Production URL is only going to work when this workflow is active. This workflow is not, so I'm going to use the test URL. And one thing to remember with N8N is that if you just send events to this test URL, it's not going to work. It's not going to fire anything. In order for it to work, you have to click listen for test event. So I'm just going to change this to post because I'm going to, in a second, post some data to this webhook. So we're going to copy that URL. I'm going to click listen for test event. Now I'm just going over to a tool called Postman, which allows us to test our webhooks. You can just drop in a URL, hit post and send some information. So we're going to send that and this should in N8N catch our response. So here we go. We can see we've got headers, queries, params. Obviously there's nothing, we haven't sent any queries or parameters. There's nothing coming up there, but it's received some information. So if you're just using webhooks to trigger a workflow, this is absolutely fine. It's going to get that response and then you can use that to trigger a workflow. But if you want to send some information with that webhook, we can add some information either in the body, query, or parameters. So I'm just going to go back to Postman and let's add a key. Who is speaking? And I'm going to give a value, Marcus. Now I'm just going to hit send again. We'll need to click listen for test event, hit send. And now we should be able to see we've got in a query, who is speaking, Marcus. Now this is really important in N8N because this is what allows us to capture information from elsewhere and then use that inside N8N. So say, for example, I wanted then to add some information into Airtable. I could create a record and I can simply go to the query here drag this and drop it in there. And then when I hit execute, this is going to add a row in Airtable with Marcus in that cell. So this is kind of at a really simple level how you can send data from one app to another using webhooks. Now let's look at a real example. What I'm going to build here is a tool in Lovable where I can enter a title of a YouTube video, click rewrite my title, and that's going to post to a webhook URL in N8N. So what I want to then happen is for N8N to catch that webhook, send it to an AI agent, which is going to use OpenAI to rewrite that title. We're then going to send the rewritten title back into Lovable where it's going to be displayed here. So first thing I'm going to do is test if Lovable is actually sending an event to our webhook. So I'm just going to double click here and you can see we've got our test URL here. I'm going to click listen for test event, go over to Lovable. Now I've told Lovable to post an event to this URL along with the title that we enter here in the body of that request. So if I just say how to use N8N, click rewrite title, I'm not expecting this to work, but I'm expecting it to send an event. So here we can see it's caught an event and we've got a title of how to use N8N, which is sent in the body. So that's looking good. The next thing I want to do is actually take that title and rewrite it. Come back to that. So next I'm going to add an AI agent. This is going to rewrite our titles. So we're just going to say, let's define a prompt below and say, take the following title and rewrite 10 variations following YouTube best practices. Let's try that for now. And then I'm just going to go to our webhook body, drop in that title just here. Now, if I connect a chat model, I'm just going to use the same one as the OpenAI one. Now, if I run that, that should hopefully return 10 alternatives. So that looks good. So I'm now going to pass that over to this AI agent, which I built earlier, which is going to rank those titles. So if we execute that, I've asked this one to structure the output in a very specific way so our Lovable app can kind of pass this correctly. So it's just converting this to kind of a nice JSON format. Okay, so this looks good. It's come back with something that looks in the correct format. So now what I want to do is to respond to that webhook and send that information back to Lovable. So this is where we're going to use the respond to webhook node. So I'm going to respond with the first incoming item. That's just going to be this. And one thing that I need to change here to get this working is our trigger. We need to change respond immediately to use the respond to webhook node because we've added that node in now. So this might work. Let's see how we get on. Now this time, instead of clicking listen for event, I want the whole workflow to run. So I'm going to click execute workflow. So it's waiting for me to call the test URL. So let's go back to Lovable and type in how to use webhooks in N8N. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but hopefully we should get pretty far. So if we go back to N8N, we can see it's now rewriting the titles. It's going to a chat model, and now it's doing the ranking and structuring the response with all the extra information I've asked for. Now, a little pro tip just while we wait for that to run. If you click into your webhook trigger, I don't think it's going to let me do it now while this is running. But something I'd highly recommend doing when working with webhooks is clicking this icon up here to pin your data. This means it's going to save that data and you don't have to keep posting to that webhook every time you want to test your workflow. So just a little kind of time-saving thing that's going to be quite helpful. A simple example of what you can do with webhooks, but it's pretty cool. It gives a little bit, just shows, okay, so our workflow has finished. It looks like it sent an event to Lovable, but let's see if that's actually worked. Yeah, okay, so it's rewritten the titles and it's displaying it here in a really nice format with all that data structured in a table. So this is quite a simple implementation of webhooks, but it just goes to show what you can do by connecting N8N with different apps. Now, if you want to get this workflow, I'll pop it in a file and link to it in the description below. But next, I want to touch on a few really important things to do to make your webhooks production ready, because as this is not secure, this is not safe, and there's likely to be a lot of errors we're going to run into. So let's have a look at the production checklist. The first thing we want to do is activate the workflow. This is going to immediately highlight any issues and things that you need to fix, but it looks like we're all good here other than an OpenAI API key that's going to have credit issues. The next thing we need to do is change to our production URL. So I'm going to give this one to lovable. So just say update the webhook URL to this one. Now let's talk about deduplication. So imagine if Lovable kind of had a crazy moment and decided to send like 500 post events to this URL. It would blow up our OpenAI credits and cause all kinds of chaos. So it's generally a good idea when working with webhooks to add in a couple of filters, a few sort of data hygiene nodes to just make sure that you're not going to create chaos elsewhere. Easiest way of doing this would be to do some kind of deduplication, whether that's via a filter or... Now the easiest way of doing that in N8N would be to add a remove duplicates node. I'm going to do remove items processed in previous executions. And you're going to need to add in some ID that's going to be unique for every response. So if you don't have this already, you could just add a query parameter that's got like a timestamp or random number generator that's unique. So I'm just going to do it based on that one for now. This is just going to prevent like any kind of crazy stuff happening with your workflow. The next thing I want to touch on is authentication. So generally speaking, you never want to leave your webhooks open without authentication because you're just leaving yourself open to abuse. So there's a few ways you can do this. You could add header auth where you send an API token or a bearer token via a query parameter, or you could add basic auth where you just set a username and password in N8N here. And then over on, in my case, Lovable, on the app that is posting the response, you will need to set up those basic credentials. I'm not going to touch on JWT auth. I'm not going to touch on JWT auth. I'm not going to touch on JWT, JSON Web Token auth here, but basically the advantage with that is you can set expiration dates. So if you only want to provide access for a certain amount of time, you can use JWT tokens. So the last thing I'd recommend setting up if you're using webhooks in production are a few of these options that will just harden the security. So if you click this option, you can see we've got a few things like allowed origins, cause, ignore bots, IP whitelisting. These are generally speaking pretty good ideas to set up. So let's start with cause. So by default, the star basically means that anyone can post to this webhook URL. Anyone could trigger your workflow. You could isolate this to specific origins. So in my case, I could change this to lovable.dev, which means that only requests coming from Lovable can post data to this webhook. If anyone else tried to post to it, it's just going to return a 404. Now, next option is ignore bots. We can generally just turn that on. And then IP whitelisting, you could add the IP address of your server or your local IP address so that only you or only your server can post events to this webhook URL. So these should just lock down your security and prevent too many headaches. Now, I hope you found this tutorial helpful. And if so, please consider hitting the like button. And if you have an idea of a video you'd like to see, drop it in the comments below. Now, if you want to level up your N8N game and put this webhook knowledge to use, check out this full N8N course, which has 10 modules, including one around webhooks, which you can watch here.